online. We're just gonna wait another couple minutes before we start.
Yeah, I've converted.
Anyway, it was really great.
I'm the actual big.
It was awesome, like catching up.
Yeah, no, one of those.
Yeah, I saw that.
Spring.
That's good. Good. I'm sorry that I didn't.
Hopefully there'll be more. I'm gonna shut this door though, because I find it super strapped.
This was not such a short note. So I knew I would get tickets for this. But it was great. It was really great.
So I think I can now say good afternoon. It is 1 minute past the hour. Good afternoon, everybody. As I think everyone in this room knows, my name is Laura Green. I'm the Associate Dean for Undergraduate Things in the college, and I am, sometimes when our former dean is not around, I just abbreviate my title a little bit. I'm very happy to welcome both those of you in the room and those of you online to our first Pedagogy in Progress presentation for the year. Before I go any further into details about that, I want to remind you that this is a series that is jointly sponsored by the College of Social Sciences and Humanities and the Humanities Center. I want to thank my colleague Angel Nieves over here, and particularly the support of Abhishek in putting this together, and also in providing the lunch that I hope you have availed yourselves or will avail yourselves of. Some of you may remember that this is, or be aware that this is actually the second of our presentations on generative AI, ChatGPT, and associated challenges or opportunities. The first panel was last year in February, also as part of the Pedagogy in Progress series, and that panel had colleagues from history, philosophy, the writing program in the English department, and the World Languages Center. You will see many of the same units represented here today, because that's where some of the really, those are units in which some of the really interesting pedagogy relating to these, I don't know what to call them, these developments, is being generated. But I also want to remind people that, you know, I think last year when we focused on this, we weren't sure whether this was just a kind of weird uninvited guest who showed up for a minute, or whether this was a new resident and in our pedagogical lives. And I think we know the answer now. ChatGPT is here to stay, and its related generative AI programs are here to stay. And to finish the sentence I started, for that reason, they are really relevant in all of our domains and disciplines. I can't really think of a discipline in which people are not going to need to grapple with this. So I do hope to expand our conversation beyond the units that have been carrying it so far. And I encourage you to share with me if you know of anybody who is approaching this kind of teaching in interesting ways, please let me know, because this will not be the last panel that we will have on this topic. Let me also plug, while I'm talking about sort of sharing a diversity of resources, let me remind you that there is a Google document called Instructor Resources for AI, for generative AI. It lives in a Google document. Everyone received it in the email that you all received about syllabi. It also, however, lives on the undergraduate program director's website. So if you need access to that document, just ask your UPD. They don't actually know that because I only just did that, but just tell them that it's in the files part of the website, and they will be able to find the link for you.
The Teams channel?
Teams channel, what did I say?
You said website.
Yeah, that's not a thing. The Teams channel, thank you for that
I
correction,
did not
Laura.
know of a website, so.
Okay, all of that said, I would like to begin introducing our panelists with great thanks for them, to them for taking the time to be with us today. They are currently seated, as it were, in the audience, and they will come up individually and present. For about 10 minutes, we want to leave plenty of time for discussion. This really is meant to be an ongoing conversation. So I hope people are bringing to it what they have been doing, seeing, and encountering. So I'm going to introduce our speakers in the order that they will be presenting. And let me start with Dr. Vance, who has really become one of our sort of go-to experts on this topic. Some of you may have seen him presenting on this topic in other venues. Vance is Associate Teaching Professor of Philosophy and Computer Science. He is jointly appointed. He has a doctorate in philosophy from Stanford University, and his teaching and research focus on moral philosophy, ranging from the ethics of digital technologies, you see the relevance here, to the works of John Stuart Mill. Vance was previously Associate Professor of Philosophy at Guilford College. He has forthcoming publications on autonomous vehicles. I hope you're a Ginnam, but I'm sure it's a little more complicated than that. Autonomous vehicles and on the moral worldviews portrayed in so-called prestige television shows. He recently helped edit and contribute chapters to the Mozilla Foundation's Responsible Computer Science Playbook, a guide for both computer science instructors and others who want to incorporate ethical reasoning into their curricula. Our second speaker is Malcolm Purinton, who is an assistant teaching professor in the history department. Malcolm is a food and world historian whose work focuses primarily on the sociocultural relationships of empire, trade, and technology in the history of beer and brewing, which is probably one of the longest beverage histories that we have, I would imagine. Yes. His first book, Globalization in a Glass, The Rise of Pilsner Beer Through Technology, Taste, and Empire, which came out this year from Bloomsbury Academic Press, examines the development and spread of this light golden lager beer and how it became the only truly global style of beer. And finally, our last but certainly not least presenter is Dr. Matt Noonan, who is Associate Teaching Professor in English, works in the writing program, and has been my colleague for a very long time, as we are both, we've both been around here for a while. Matt has a doctoral degree from Northeastern University, where he completed a project called Making Maps, Teacher Inquiry and the Assessment of ESL Writers. He also holds an MFA in painting with a concentration in painting, printmaking, and ceramics from the Massachusetts College of Art down the street there. He's presented at a number of conferences and has published 2 chapters in books on translingual pedagogy. Translingual is a very difficult word to say, pedagogies, and the internationalization of US writing programs. Here at Northeastern, Matt has held various positions in the university, including director of PMIS. I do not know what that means.
Peer mentoring for international students.
Thank you. Peer mentoring for international students and director of ESOL and assessment and placement. And he is currently a member of the Writing Program Assessment Committee, where he and his colleagues examine anti-racist assessment practices. So you will see we have a broad range of expertise represented here today. And I would like to invite Vance to come up to the podium.
Thank you, Laura. Thanks to all of you for coming. And there was another invited guest, Dr. Meredith Clark, who has a cross appointment in Camden, who unfortunately wasn't able to come today. So that means the result is a manel, but that couldn't be helped in this situation.
That had not escaped my notice. Thank you.
Yeah. And also, so while I'm still apologizing for things. I want to apologize for being here for probably the 4th or 5th time, I think, since February, perhaps not in this room specifically, but on different panels across the university that have been asking this kind of question about what should we do about generative models and how should that change our teaching or whether it should change our teaching. So those of you who are hearing me, this won't be entirely a rerun. I've rearranged some of the order in which I say things, so at least there will be some novelty that way. So as I've said before, I'm not really using generative models in my courses except for the limited cases that I'll talk about more in a moment. Instead, I'm teaching about them. And so the slides that I have prepared today are showing some of the different ways in which I'm teaching about them. So where does that teaching happen? Most of that teaching happens in a course that is called Technology and Human Values, Philosophy 1145. I'm currently teaching 2 sections of that course, as I do every semester. It's an intro-level undergraduate course. I have colleagues both here and at the Mills campus who also teach sections of that course. So in any given term, including summers, there are probably 200 or more students who are taking one section of this course. So in my section, why is that the case that the course is so populated? So it fulfills a requirement for Corey students. They have a computing and social issues requirement, and this is a course that fulfills that. It also is one of the new path courses. So 90% roughly of the students that I'm teaching in that course are not CSSH students, they're Corey students, majoring in cybersecurity, computer science, or data science. So I want to talk about 4 different kinds of questions that I'm going to be posing when we get to this unit of the course this semester. So I meant to point this in your general direction, is that right? Let's see if I can get this to work.
There we go.
Great. Okay, first question, how do they work? So in my sections of the course this semester, when we reach that unit of the course, which should be sometime around mid-November, the first thing that I'm going to do is to provide students with a couple of what I call gentle introductions, similar to this one here by Mark Riedel, which I recommend highly to you if you haven't seen that one yet. Just as a guide to the underlying technological mechanisms that make these models possible. So although these are mostly Corey students, that doesn't mean they come out of the womb already understanding on a deep level some of the kind of conceptual or computational underpinnings of a lot of the systems that they work with or that they're familiar with. So I think it's valuable and important for us as faculty to use the kinds of resources that Laura mentioned, as well as others that we might come across that can help us understand in language that is comfortable to us and at a variety of levels of sophistication and technical difficulty, what is actually going on with these models? How do they work? What are their components? So there are great resources both from Cattler as well as the Teams channel that Laura mentioned, where I think we can all help each other again, to find language that is understandable to us in whatever particular disciplines that we're coming from, but that can also be interesting to our students. And so some of that is text-based, but there are some great YouTube explainers as well. There are podcasts. So I recommend, just again, if this is a kind of in-progress pedagogy talk, just exploring, and it may also be salutary to have your students go out and see what they're able to find, again, that can help them understand the sort of technological underpinnings of these models. Second question, how should we understand how these things work? So many of you are already familiar with Alan Turing's 1950 paper in which he proposes that the question, can a human examiner consistently misidentify whether their interlocutor is a human or a machine, should replace the question, can a machine think? So to put the question differently, Turing argued that the question, can a machine think, is not particularly interesting, in part because it's not a tractable kind of question. And a more tractable kind of question would be, could a machine be built such that if a human didn't realize that it was communicating with that machine, the human would think that it was communicating with a human. And so this is a question that has been resurrected now in the light of many people's interactions with these generative models, both the ones that produce images and the ones that produce text. So my plan later in the semester, again, when we get to this unit, is to devote class time to having students enter specific prompts to various generative models and to evaluate what, in light of Turing's proposed test, we can infer about those models' capabilities and capacities. For example, how and why is conversational ability or artistic output related to evidence of consciousness, self-consciousness, sentience, intelligence? To what extent are we ascribing rather than recognizing those capacities in any system, whether it be another human or a non-human animal, or now a machine or a software system? Third question, who helps to make it possible for these systems to work? So it's valuable to think of generative models as re-raising the kind of metaphysical questions that I just did. But I think there might be prior questions if we also understand these systems, as I want my students to, in terms of the labor that it takes to create and maintain them. So we'll be reading and hearing from people in the Tech Workers Coalition, as well as learning from more about the ways in which human labor is hidden, but still necessary for generative models to produce comparatively less toxic results than they otherwise would after having been trained on a corpus that includes words and images that are both sublime and horrific. So on the slide here, you see an example. This is a company that is based in Kenya that was hired by OpenAI as OpenAI was introducing some of the more recent models of GPT. And so their job is to read all of the things. So in order, for example, to have a model that doesn't produce anti-Semitic outputs, you first have to tell the model what an anti-Semitic output looks like, which means you need to have humans reading a bunch of stuff that is anti-Semitic and labeling it as such. So it's humans that make the magic possible behind the scenes. And we always need to bring them out of the shadows and not the back wings, right? But put them really front and center. Final question, or penultimate question. How do they make us reevaluate what is valuable about work? So the students will be reading a co-authored paper by the philosophers Sven Nyholm and John Danaher, in which they ask us to reflect carefully on the relationships between work, jobs, and achievement, and on the value of those things. Some of our students are eager to contemplate how many, quote, useless jobs will be automated away, as if the technologies themselves are independent actors. Other students, or even sometimes some of those same students, express curiosity, perplexity, and even alarm about what their and their loved ones' own employment will look like, especially if it involves working for people who can't wait to replace them. Those are not questions that I can answer, unfortunately. What I can do is to use papers like the one that we'll be reading later in the course to foster a kind of class conversation about which aspects of the work that we do, whether we're talking about work that we do for pay or not, are most meaningful to us. How that meaningfulness is or isn't grounded in the relationship between our own efforts and the outcomes or output, and when or why it might make sense to use supplements or even to stop doing a particular task and let some other system handle it. Well, examples abound. They can come up later in discussion. And that brings me to, this really is my final point. So I'm heartily endorsing a recent-ish blog post by one of my departmental colleagues, many of you may know, Professor Matt Smith, in which he encourages us to remember something that we already know. So this is a quotation from the blog post. Focusing on preventing cheating is not the same as focusing on good pedagogy. So ultimately, I want our students, I think we all want our students to see our courses as chances to think carefully about the kinds of relationships we want them to have to their own learning and how that's related to what they value on reflection. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'll say thanks for having me. This is definitely something we've all been dealing with and just like spending way too much time thinking about. So I'm excited to be part of a discussion on this. So in looking at this, I just kind of want to start of basically where I've been since last February. Just feeling like I'm just sticking my finger in the dike to stop the flood that's coming out. I've also been playing around with like the Adobe version of visual like creation. So, and this is something I did for my history of technology class this semester. Is like the headlining picture is one that I worked on, tweaked within Firefly. Not great. This is the prompt is little Dutch boy hero of Harlem plugging a small hole in stone wall with his finger and water coming from the hole. It took me like 20 minutes to get to this.
I guess they don't get plugging.
I tried. I was At some point I was like, okay, we're done here. This is enough. And it really illustrates, where we're at right now. And so that's what I've been doing with looking at my syllabi, like adding in like a nice little placer, along the lines of, plagiarism, and just be like, make sure you're like, if you're using this, make sure you're citing it. And then I've just switched around some of my assignments into incorporating citations. I'm just kind of like, all right, utilizing everything of just kind of, we're gonna keep putting the water back in a little bit to make sure that using citations, which is part of the process of all my history classes, but now it's a lot more explicit and much more necessary and something for them to watch out with the grading that's coming through. So current approach is citation. So this is lots of footnotes, Chicago style. There are very others that incorporate some version of city life. But that's kind of where I'm at right now. Even my history of technology class, my world history classes, with history majors, it's very different because, well, they're the majors, they're the ones that are really interested in doing the writing and learning the citation styles and doing all these types of things. So with the larger survey classes, last spring I found in my history of tech class that doing the in-class prompts, I was getting some whistleblowers, some students being like, yo, that guy, he's doing ChatGPT. I'm like, noted. I need to figure out how I'm gonna do these quizzes and like incorporate this into a classroom activity instead of something that's gonna be done online only. So making it a lot more just kind of interactive, personal, again, finger in the dike, just trying to put this off until I can fully understand more about how I can incorporate it. Because the next stage I want to go for is, I've been spending a lot of time trying to play with ChatGPT, only a 3.5 version, because I'm also a beer journalist for Regional Magazine. So I had to do this very quick brewery profile. I was like, all right, okay, let's give it a shot. So, I mean, it's horrible. The outcome has been terrible. Haven't gotten the chance to try 4.0, which is next level, but everything I've been able to play with has come out quite poorly. This is a great final paper after edits. Interpret as you will. So what I want to do is bring, like, make it part of the tools that can be used. So with my approach, it's generally, learning about analysis of sources, and learning how to summarize and, not regurgitate, but analyze and attribute and come out with your own ideas to come up with something that involves that critical thinking capability, with where your source is coming from, how are you using them, and recognizing the backgrounds from those, just looking at the context. But what I want to do is, because this is not going to be going away, like this is a tool. I've been attempting so far. The only things I've gotten that have been really good have been Instant Pot recipes, which you can tweak pretty well. Like I'm not using dried beans. I'm using from a can. So what I want to do is incorporate into coursework. So some of ideas that I'm looking at is using various levels of generative AI text. So let's try with the different, like GTP, the 3.5, then the 4.0. Let's use a prompt from our course activities, from our sources, what we're talking about, and then have them analyze what comes out. Like, how does this relate? Like, how closely does this align with what we're talking about? Does it show argumentation? Does it show any type of critical response? How would you then take this and then move yourself forward? So using those, you can then look at student critiques, like how their results show stages of development of generative AI. And then how they can then utilize this potentially to actually use it as a beginning point for their own outlines, for their own writing, as a place. Because as we all know, that blank page is always really frightening, because of how much is in your head. So, I mean, when I did that brewery profile, what came out was terrible, but it inspired me enough that I was able to get my own 200 words done in like 5 minutes. I was like, okay, yeah, now I know what I'm not gonna do, but now I know what I want to say. So I have found it to be a little bit helpful, with deadlines, the writing deadlines, but I want to be able to make it a part of the tool chest that we can bring in. So that is basically where I'm at right now. And I'm looking forward to talking more.
Okay, so thank you for an opportunity to share the work my writers are doing with me this semester. I was invited to apply for what's in the writing program called innovation courses, and the course that I'm running this semester is called Composing in the Age of AI, Algorithmic Audience Awareness. The reason behind my course, at least the argument that I made to my colleagues, was that the models of audience that we have within composition studies and writing studies needed updating. That when we think about audience, and when I started to look through the literature, I was still seeing texts from 1984, 1990 talking about audience in the writing process. That didn't seem to become show an awareness of the space that writers were working in now and the kinds of contexts that were influencing their understanding of audience. So our leading question for the class is how do algorithms, shape a writer's practice? And the writing courses that I teach are courses which always understand the nature of the work that we're doing happening in what Geisler calls dual problem spaces, right? There are content problems that writers are trying to solve, but then there are also rhetorical process problems that writers are trying to solve. And oftentimes, part of the role of, or my role in the classroom is to help disentangle those or help to show the relationships between those. So I thought today, with this invitation, I wanted to nest this particular course within a broader idea of how I understand teaching and learning, in part because I see my reaction to these AI and large language models in ways different than how I hear conversations happening in other parts of the university. And when I reflect on why that's so, why I don't see it as a threat, but as an opportunity, I think about it through my own kind of position as an educator and the different traditions that I'm coming out of as a teacher. So the text that's been useful to me in recent years to articulate some of this is Andrea English's book called Discontinuity in Learning. And one of the things that I share with my writers is this idea that difficulty is not a problem, but a beginning point. And so she traces this back to Dewey and this idea of existential uncertainty. That is, the beginning of all learning processes start with the learner being in this kind of panic mode of not knowing, right? And that very uncomfortable emotional place. And so this is, of course, a position I'm in as an educator too, right? As these conversations that started back in December, there was a lot of anxiety that was expressed by my colleagues in thinking about AI in the classroom. And a lot of uncertainty in terms of what it meant for the kind of work that I do with students. So I take that as a kind of a shared space for myself and the writers that I'm working with, right? That we're in a similar position in terms of uncertainty. The difference being that I like being in that space. I'm comfortable with doubt. As a practicing artist, as Laura said, that's the space I'm always hunting for, is like what I don't know and what makes me anxious. That's the productive space. If I figure something out with the work that I'm doing, then it doesn't interest me anymore. And so for a lot of the writers that I'm working with, though, where they're at in terms of their own thinking as learners is that they're still trying to move as quickly as possible away from uncertainty. They want the confidence in what they say, right? So part of what we're doing then in the class is trying to recognize these, what English calls pre-reflective beginnings, right? Those moments of existential uncertainty, and then use reflection to help writers identify and articulate what the nature of their particular problem is, so that they can frame it in such a way to work on it, right? Not necessarily to solve it, but to understand what the nature of that problem is, right? So in the class that we're doing now, We begin by thinking about the central claims of the course. This is kind of where we've been up to this point, that learning is a social activity, writing is a social activity. I asked them to act as researchers to see where that conversation's been, and then to think about how they might want to contribute to that conversation or challenge some of the findings of it. We've also looked at different models of reading, because ultimately all the writing classes at Northeastern are interested in the practice of writers, right? And so writers are readers, so we have to understand what that relationship is. They have to understand the different models of reading that they use. And so most of the writers I'm working with this semester came in with a model of reading that was aligned with kind of reading from information, right? That the purpose of reading is to get content out of something. And so we introduced models like Buns, reading like a writer, which is looking at text from the perspective of what choices was the writer making here? What other choices could she have made in order to create different effects in the reader, right? So in Buns' model of reading, what students are asked to pay attention to are things like context, audience, and genre. And then in this past week, we started to move on to talk about algorithms in particular around this idea of reading. So the text that they were given was a piece by Jones out of Linguistics and Education entitled "The Text is Reading You." And in that piece, he shares some research that he was doing with students. He invited students in Hong Kong and London to write about their use of algorithms and how they understood the way in which the text was, they were interacting with online text. And he invited them to do what he called algorithmic inventories. And out of that work, he framed 6 metaphors that these writers were working with to kind of engage with the algorithm. So algorithm as oracle, like it knew what I was going to do. Algorithm as adversary, that is, I know what it wants me to do, but I want to do something else instead, right? And so we're in the point of the conversation now that we're using those metaphors and saying, are these adequate? What about your own experience as a practicing writer? Which metaphors are useful to you in helping you think about your experience, your practice? Which metaphors might you want to add? And so for me, again, in terms of sharing the work that they're doing, it's really interesting for me to hear how they work with technology, right? From things like Turnitin to ChatGPT and other large language models, the different ways in which they think about themselves as gaming the system, right? So one of the writers shared with me this past week that he was using GPT-O, I guess, to see whether his work was going to be read as generated, right? Because he was concerned about that policing, or what we call, I guess in writing studies, cop shit, like the teachers on top of me kind of like looking to surveil my work and catch me in the act, right? And so what this particular writer did was he composed it on his own, but then he threw it through these generators as a way to check to make sure his teacher wouldn't think that he had used it this way. And it came back and said, yes, this is AI generated in these places. And he went back and revised his own writing in order to make it seem less AI generated, right? Which is very, again, interesting relationship with the technology and interesting practice as a writer. Okay, so I'll leave it at that. That's kind of where we're headed and what we're doing.
I think that was a very provocative place to end. So I'm just intrigued by the idea of someone revising their own personally generated text because a machine thinks that a person will think it's machine generated. I love that. So on that note, we do now have plenty of time for discussion. Abhishek, is it possible, will you be monitoring? Is there a chat that you will be monitoring? Yeah. So we welcome comments or questions or contributions from our online participants, as well as those of us in the room. If I can just remind people when you stick your hand up or when you join us from online to identify yourself. This is like the hardest thing to remember, but it really is helpful for people to know whom they're speaking with. So Abhishek, do we have anyone online?
We do have a few people online. Questions?
No questions yet? Okay, then let us start with the room. Yes, and I'm sorry, I actually don't know who you are.
David Dawson. I'm actually the senior program manager for the Network Science PhD program.
Oh, awesome.
So I
Thank
am
you for
not
being
a
here.
faculty member. Yeah, thank you for having us. So thank you all for speaking. It was really helpful. The three things that I pulled out, one, Vance, actually the question I think would be really interesting, at what point are humans irrelevant? Instead of it being at what point the machines are doing X, Y, and Z, it becomes a question about our usefulness, I guess you could say, in terms of how we work with machines. But to Matt, and I'm sorry, what was your name? Because
That's Matt.
Matt and
Malcolm.
I apologize, Matt and Malcolm. I think your points are really interesting as well. So Malcolm, AI as a tool, and Matt, how to create within boundaries. I see AI as something that really is not different from a lot of things that we've experienced in the past. For example, we had spell check, for example, or we've had things like citation managers and things like that. So at a certain point, it's like, why be afraid of this when this is just something that it's another thing that we're going to have to be using to improve, honestly. And Matt, I also thought it was really interesting how you kind of broke that down in an algorithmic way of thinking, because when it comes down to it, academic writing is very algorithmic. We have very set kind of like the way we do something, and then you have to work within that framework to actually be able to produce something. So thank you all for that. My question actually is, how is this being brought to PhD students? Because you're training you're training the eventual teachers. You have people who are going to be TAs, you have people who are going to be instructors of record. So how do they fit into this kind of instruction that you're also doing with undergraduates?
Dang, that's a good question.
Train our TAs at all?
Okay, first of all, we absolutely need you, and I'm sure that Matt, for example, could speak to how we do this briefly in the English department. But do you know whether there has been any action on thinking about this?
Yeah, so I wasn't part of the training that we do with our incoming teachers this semester, so I don't know if this was a part of the conversation. It is part of the writing program conversation, and those new PhD students and as well as our new teaching docs are asked to be at the beginning of the quarter meeting, and so these conversations and some of this thinking is shared in that moment. I would say to that point about doctoral students and training, part of it is helping those students across the university understand where they're coming out of in terms of being teachers. Like, what do they see their role in the classroom? And it seems to me that there are some departments who are thinking carefully about like the identity of teachers and what the kind of work they want those teachers to do in the classroom, and some that are not thinking about it at all and thinking about the idea of education being knowledge transmission, right? And so here are the things that our PhD students are working on. Isn't this cool? And oh, by the way, they have to teach, right? Because this is how, right? So having conversations with them about their practice as teachers, I think this would fall under the umbrella of like, how do you deal with technologies in the classroom? How do you, right? And I think in order to understand that, they have to have some awareness of the models of education that they're coming out of, or they align themselves with, right? That's my sense of it.
I can speak to just students that are my TAs, because I don't advise graduate students. Though I am now the faculty advisor for the Graduate Student Association for the History Department. So I've been talking with them a lot about when I'm mentoring in a classroom, I am just very open about my struggles. So when I have a TA, it's a shared experience of like, all right, I'll be doing like the lecturing, the stuff in front of the class, and you'll be doing most of the grading, but this is how I developed the syllabus. This is how I changed the syllabus this semester versus last semester based upon, new, just, ChatGPT, like bring this stuff, bring generative AI into it. And then talking about how I'm shifting like last semester, history of technology. All right, just so you know, this assignment is different. and this is why. This is like why I'm approaching this. And so it's something that they are going to be thinking about and going to have to deal with as well. And I haven't heard, I mean, from the graduate students, I haven't heard anything explicitly about their fears about generative AI or large language systems. So I'm interested to see actually how that goes. But for me, it's really kind of like a one-on-one, like we're working on this class together, and here's how, here like kind of my checklist. These are some of my ways I've gamed the system of like how to make it easier for me to function teaching across several frames of mind with different content. So that's how I've been approaching it.
Can I return to the examples that you were using earlier to talk about like how these technologies enter the classroom? Because I think that for me, when I'm thinking about these generative AI models and AI in general, the analogy that I make is photography and painting, right? That disruption of a new technology changed the way people were thinking about like what the function of painting was and what it, right? I think we're talking about that level of radicalness when we're talking about large language models and AI. It's not, hey, we got spell check now, right? Which is going to tweak around the edges. This is going to fundamentally change how we think about that activity of knowledge getting into making and stuff and our relationship to the tools that we have. And again, be more on that. That's exciting, right? Because I'm interested in, again, how the writers that I'm working with think about themselves as learners and also think about themselves as producing knowledge in the space together.
My department doesn't have a graduate program, which I'm thrilled about actually. So I don't, I won't be supervising any doctoral students, at least not philosophy doctoral students, probably for the foreseeable future. However, this semester I do have a couple of undergraduate TAs for the course that I teach, and we did talk with them. I talked with them at the beginning of the semester about having taken my course, now that you all are sophomores or juniors, who are Corey students, where for a long time, people in CS have had to struggle with this question of the availability of code anywhere and a culture that encourages sharing and reusing things. What do you think are reasonable policies for us as the people running this particular course when it comes to the students' use of generative models? And since they are just a year or two ahead of the people who are the students in the class, they have some really good advice, I think. And some of it's congruent with what Matt says in his paper, some of which I'm happy to know I was already doing, but just rethinking even things about what are your policies about deadlines. So kind of taking a step back and kind of reflecting on some of the things you were asking students to reflect on. That is to say, what is the relationship, what is my own relationship to the stuff that I'm being made to submit as an assignment? And the word submit is telling there, I suppose, but how can it feel less like something that is being imposed and something that's a little more self-directed? And ultimately, as I said, and as I think Matt argues in his blog post, I don't want to be a cop in the class, and I don't want to have to spend a lot of time worrying about the authenticity or the provenance of what students are turning in. Some are probably going to get away with things, and I'm happy to make my peace with that.
That's crucial. Gardana.
Yeah, well, I think.
And if you can just introduce
I'm
yourself.
Gordana Abranovich from Sociology and Anthropology Department. And for us, this is how sociology started. It started with Industrial Revolution. So I think in many ways defined like what we do and what we teach. But talking to students in my first year on this seminar that I have students from different background, majors, very few knew anything about ChatGPT. And understanding the students now, I think it's wrong. That most students don't have a clue about what's going on in a sense. They heard about it, they don't necessarily use it, don't have skills how to use it. I have a large intro to sociology class of 100 students. It was also, most people didn't use it. They might heard and did something of it. Some are actually even afraid of it. So it's really very this idea that students actually are using it large, I don't think it's necessarily true. And I don't really know how we know what we know about it. So the question is what we do in our classroom as we are dealing with students who don't have those type of skills. So in my first year class, I asked them first to develop research question for the assignment they had to do, and then they had to critique each other and work with that. And then I said, let's do the ChatGTP. And so I actually taught them how to assign in it. They didn't even, one student told after class, thank me for introducing him to ChatGPT. And he is, not computer, but engineering student. So it's not like social science students. So it's not like this is social science students. They're in variety of other fields. They heard about debates, but they didn't necessarily heard about, they don't have the personal experience. So what they did when they put their question in, then we had this discussion. Is that better or is it more clear? Because I asked for clarity. I said the prompt was added for clarity. And was it more clear? Did it miss something? In which way, was different? And so we kind of had that type of discussion. And then from there, we went to a discussion, what's the use of ChatGPT? How is AI changing our life? And I think then they were able to kind of because they heard the debates, but not necessarily have this personal experience. So for me, it is in a sense how we can use it as a tool. How can we get them to use it as, as editor, as you talk about, like Grammarly, people use Grammarly for it. Is that like a Grammarly or it's different? But also how to not to be afraid of it. And therefore, then you can start asking different questions and we'll see how it goes. But I think those little steps might be something that we can start. I don't think in a couple of years, I don't think we'll have that. Everybody will know it. But for me, that was the really that question of, and I have to add one more comment about it is that I start by telling them, I don't want your perfect answer as we start with both classes. I want you to be imperfect. I want you to, it's a process, it's not the outcome, because this is about outcome and what we are, education is process. So don't be afraid that if you do when you're putting something, it's not good, say what you think and then we will work from it. And I think that type of when students cheat, they cheat because of those reasons. I don't think that, because they are on deadlines, they want to be perfect, they worry about their grades. And so the first thing was don't worry about the grade. Don't worry, is it good? And then what makes us human is that we are imperfect. And so I think that is this part of at least how I am kind of understanding this process, because I'm learning as they're learning too. So, so it was very useful to hear from what you're talking about. And I wish we have this guy. I think this is going to continue to be something to talk about.
Something you said just made me think that perhaps thank you, Laura, learners, novice learners, in my experience, are really, let me put it differently, crafting a good research question is quite difficult. I think we all have many occasions on which we experience that either for ourselves or we think, we say to students like, oh, come up with a research question, and it just, what is come up with is not one. Because it turns out that there's like a whole set of mental processes before coming up with the question that we actually sort of forgot to tell anyone about. And I have noticed even in my limited use of ChatGPT that, it does really it does better with sharper questions, although perhaps not the art. I don't know what that art version up there was doing, but certainly the ChatGPT version. But so I'm just thinking about maybe there are ways that ChatGPT specifically could be a really good tool for helping students understand how to refine a research question, because it's like, you could really see what a bad one produces, right? I don't know. Does that resonate for anybody?
Yeah, 'cause sometimes you're just like the blank page fear, like trying to come up with a question. If you just type in, what are some of the major questions about an interesting topic? If you start without a question, the question can be just, what are you interested in? So when I'm teaching like the 1200 level of for history majors, I teach as a food history class. And so by skills of being a historian, like how do you approach an archive? How do you just use just very specific, like how do you do an outline? But then I'll have them do a larger project on a food or drink of their choice. So start off with something that they find interesting on their own, within a broad umbrella, and then working through questions you might have about it. So, I mean, everyone from Chicago does hot dogs, every single one. So it's just kind of seeing some of those things coming through, but asking though, starting without a question, just getting them thinking about what they're interested in, why are they there, then they're already have, especially with the majors, they already have a love for the topic. And then they already have certain aspects of the topic that they're also very much enjoying. And then they can incorporate that into, well, let's start playing around with this large data model of just what can I parse from that? What are some of the big questions that people have already asked and that I can go through? It's like using Wikipedia, which has been like, all right, you have this information, follow the source. Like find out where it leads you down through, or like reading an article from the conversation. Very easily digestible, but then you can follow the different hyperlinks to read the academic papers, find links to the books, and follow yourself down into a great place to then start mining bibliographies and finding what questions people have already feel like they've answered. Do you agree?
Look at me. I mean, I feel to a certain extent that at least how it is right now, GPT might not be the best thing for that. Because like you said, Wikipedia or even a search engine or Google Scholar
Yeah.
is going to get you in that same place. Plus, they haven't necessarily put the guardrails on enough where you put something in there and then it could give you something that makes absolutely no sense. So I think if that was incorporated in a class, you would also have to consider or at least give the disclaimer that you need to make sure that this is actually something that's accurate and it's not like some information from a random blog from somebody who thinks they know things and they don't really know it.
Which is true of Wikipedia too, right, to a certain extent. Yeah, Tom,
I was thinking,
and if you could just introduce yourself.
yes, my name is Tom Ackberry. I'm in the writing program in the English department with Matt. Well, it seems like the metaphor people usually use is tool, which suggests that you could, program certain moments in your pedagogy. Well, we're going to use the tool in this way at that moment, and it has pluses and minuses. But I also wonder, we don't know enough, I think, about the origins of the technology, who controls it, whose interests it serves, what makes the algorithms. I mean, the company is very coy about this because they're in competition in a market for these sort of things. And I think it's interesting to me that it is here and suddenly everyone knows about it. OpenAI does no advertisements, but somehow the saturation is almost complete. And that itself is all these sort of social phenomena about our reception of technologies is baffling, which I think is also has to be part of our approach to the technology, sort of the anthropological, social, historical sort of origins of technology and then our reception of it. Matt, you mentioned with photography disrupted, visualization. The difference here is that we are in the moment ourselves. We're not studying what happened in the past. We are actors in it. It reminds me a little bit about the scene in 2001 where the monolith comes down and then everyone's behavior is shaped in some way by this, which was satirized and sort of incompletely in the Barbie movie.
Yes.
But suddenly it's here and we have to do that, and we as academics have to adapt. And it's a tool, but I think there's also just again understanding, and who knows, is OpenAI going to start charging for this next semester and things like this? You have to access the highest level, you do have to pay a subscription. I think the GPT-4, and how would that disrupt things? And it exacerbates certain things I think we're concerned with in our pedagogy, which is equity and access to these things. This is a technological things like that, and I think it's sort of, in some ways, it extends the problems that we are pulled up to critique in our work, and then we don't know what texts make up the database. Who is represented in the database that make the decision about the transformer that decides what is the next word to put in for the writing generative technology. So I think it's also an opportunity to sort of maybe use the technology in certain ways, but also see the richness of how we think about the origins of these things and our reception of them.
Yeah, which you teach about that a little bit, right, Vance, the origin?
Yeah. all of the kinds of questions that you were just raising, because it's not just OpenAI, it's the fact that Microsoft owns a portion of OpenAI. They're wanting, so right now you have to go to a separate space to interact with these models, but now imagine that it's just part of Microsoft Word or it's part of Excel. You just say, here's some data, make me a spreadsheet. Or, hey, I have to give a pedagogy in progress talk, make me some slides. Right, so.
You can actually do that now.
Well, so even just the idea that you're having to hesitate to intentionally use the tool as opposed to the thing that's integrated into things you're already using, that won't be the case for much longer. But yeah, I mean, there's a great article in the Times the other day, co-written by Bruce Schneider, that was talking about this can be talked about at the level of rhetoric as well. And so what they're doing a nice job of in that piece is just saying there are all these different camps who are trying to convince the rest of us how we should be thinking about all of this in the first place. And so that's very much contested grounds, right? So are these just like spell checkers? Well, not really, but then if they're not like that, then what are they? Who's standing to benefit from this? Are we being too suspicious and tinfoil hatted if we even raise that question? So yeah, I mean, it's fun to be part of that contestation, and I'm dismayed sometimes when there are people saying that we should just dive in. I think part of our role as teachers is to not always dive in. I mean, or to do it in a responsible way where we're able to point out to our students where the rocks are and where the sharks are.
And I don't know if you saw Chronicle Higher Education just last week, I think, or beginning of this last week, had that our journalists are using some of those models as a peer review, peer review journals. So you know that in journals we have a hard time getting peer reviewers, and so now all of a sudden you have this technology. But then we have a writers' strike, which also changed it. So people are fighting it. So on both sides.
Yeah, it's very much a labor issue, I think.
Labor,
Not just, I mean, I'm as impressed by the whiz-bangness as anyone, but it's labor. It's somebody's labor.
And for us in sociology, it's not about technology, it's about our society. We are creating those. It's not like what are the background.
I think we are almost out of time. I want to give you a little time to tease people with some previews of what's coming up next.
Sure.
So may I thank our panelists very much. As well as all of our viewers. Thank you for being here online as well. And turn it over to Amha.
Sure, thank you so much. Thank you, Laura, for that. Thank you to our speakers. I just wanted to remind us on Monday, October 23rd, Dr. Sylvia Prina will be Associate Professor of Economics, will be presenting on public opinion and racial bias in the US labor market for our Faculty Works in Progress series, and we're looking forward to that. Emails will be going out, and I want to thank Tanya and Abhishek for their support in making this possible, and to Laura for being such a good partner in this process. And thank you all for coming out. I know the semester has already gotten into full swing, but I appreciate you all, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you online.
Did not get lunch or did not get enough lunch, please help yourself. It's just around the corner that way.
And please take for others.
That's right.